The Worldview of Paul Cézanne, Chapter 14. In some unknown way, color and form build up the appearance of any given object, yet color and form are not definite known qualities, as they are usually defined. It is almost as if form hovers around or about a certain area and is concentrated in a certain area that becomes the object, which is then further defined by color. But color itself in nature seems to hover about form too, while actually being nowhere attached to it upon close inspection. Both color and form can theoretically be followed and seen to have a nebulousness that is most astonishing once the definitions of the objects are momentarily dismissed by the eye. Stare at the most emphatic leaf long enough, and its distinctions merge into a form that somehow loses its object nature. And the same with the color that sometimes seems to float just above the form. It's easy enough to say that this is just an optical illusion. I believe, however, that the effect is indicative of the way in which objects emerge, rising into emphasis from form and color. The form must be tinged by color, or we would not perceive it at all. It would be invisible. Yet color and form are separate in essence. I believe, and their intersection is the cause of objects. Oh, just a minute. I'm reading that sentence wrong. Let me start that sentence over again. Yet color and form are separate in essence, I believe, and their intersection is the cause of objects as we perceive them. An object seems to be somewhat smaller than the form out of which it emerges, and so does its color. These are, I admit, subtle distinctions, but important ones. Also, forms seem to extend one into another in ways that objects do not. Take a vase, for example, or a vase, for example. To the careful eye, its color will extend out beyond its boundaries, though less intensely, of course, than upon the vase itself. And the color will not just seem to bleed outward, surrounding the vase, but will follow the vase's shape into a larger surrounding form in which the vase itself seems to be positioned, in the same way that the artist might position the vase on a shelf. There will be succeedingly less vivid areas of color in the same fashion out from the first, each following the vase's shape and seeming to outline a larger form, a form, however, that does not have weight or mass until we approach the vase itself. This larger form will extend outward, merging with other forms also surrounding other objects, and together these form patterns of angles, curves, and cubes, somewhat like the patterns of the waves seen from a boat. It is almost as if there were a tide of physical matter, invisibly coming and going, that breaks in quotes, into objects as it casts out its spray in quotes, or the surrounding forms from which the object breaks loose. I'm going to read that sentence again. It is almost as if there were a tide of physical matter invisibly coming and going that breaks into objects as it casts out its spray, or the surrounding forms from which the objects break loose. In any case, while objects in a still life do not move, there is a certain give and take between the object and its form, as if an object only appears when a certain intensity is reached, when it bursts out of its form, or as if any object is made up of form constantly trying to define itself in terms of specification. Objects should be respected then, but not overly defined, for a true understanding will show that the object arises out of its form, and that the object's reality in some way extends beyond itself. The forms out of which objects arise compose a structure of interlocking angles, cubes, and curves from which the painting, like the object, will be constructed. These are not to be thought of as dead geometrical forms or planes of calculus, but rather as the living inclinations or pre-shapes out of which the objects emerge, themselves formed of light and color moving through space. They seem drenched with color again, otherwise they would be invisible completely. Perhaps they are nature's brushstrokes, nature's underpainting, perceivable only to the most practiced eye, from which the finished picture of the world emerges. That world, it occurs to me, may be, in its way, as much an illusion as a painting is, or rather, as we build up the illusion of objects within a painting by certain brushstrokes and symbolic shapes, the physical world may be constructed in the same fashion. Get too close or too far away from the painting, and according to the painting and the circumstances, the illusion of objects breaks down. Perhaps when you examine the world too closely on the one hand, or detach yourself mentally too far from the other, then the objects within it lose their boundaries in the same way. In all of this, color plays its vital part, but color power is dependent upon its application. The brush strokes which must carry it. Much of the work involved with color is done on the canvas itself. Is not done, on the canvas itself, but on the palette or on the preliminary boards and test pieces. Obviously, color is used to mold and sculpt images, to bring them nearer or farther away, and so color must be considered according to the ascending or descending quality in connection with horizontal and vertical planes. A too vivid value can give a vertical effect when none is desired, while its upthrusting nature can be used to advantage to imply complementary but different fields of perspective. Color must always be used in connection with perspective, whether to complement a given plane or to add contrasting elements, without, however, disturbing the composition's basic alignments. The use of values is extremely important in building up the suggestive objects as just mentioned, strong values being positioned so that they imply solidity and depth when desired, though these are not necessarily backed up by any continuing emphatic strokes that would by themselves indicate a definite form. Instead, the contrasting value might be used not one alongside the other, but alternating values of, say, one color suggesting further a distance between suggested objects. The strong values appearing in precisely designated strokes can indicate from one focus the light striking and highlighting one object, and yet from another focus the same value can merge with its neighbor, forming part of another suggested object entirely. The artist's intent is important here, for he will use colors and their values according to the problems and challenges that he has selected. Any color chart provides basic information concerning the mixture of colors, but nothing except the artist's eye can show him how to use color to his or her own best purposes. On the one hand, each color has a character of its own, with its values showing different facets, dispositions, and tendencies. And besides this, each artist will relate to the colors differently, finding those that complement his intentions and those that don't. Colors also have an emotional content to which each person responds differently. For me, blues and greens are paramount because they and their value can be so intermixed to suggest, say, the fluidity of water or the soft solidarity of a leaf, the instant intensity of a window plant or the distant coolness of a mountain. The two colors, one woven through the other, allow for a sense of motion, difficult to find elsewhere, bringing the shadows of draperies or waves, equally alive, and seeming to motivate objects rather than pinning them to an underpainting. Red is too obvious a mover. It should be used with discretion and never straight from the tube, except for the most minute of amounts. Since light is never pure white or yellow, however, red on the orange end serves to add life to light, though again used in small amounts and in natural surroundings. Light will always contain elements of green. To a sculptor, a chunk of stone, say, is alive. He sees it as a repository of possible statues. The form of it suggests the shapes that could emerge, and from this, more or less, undifferentiated forms, he carves out his sculpture. Since he is dealing with such material, only one such sculpture can be made from the same chunk of stone. He may break chunks down, but each of them will present him with the same challenge. No statue can be two statues at once. While this is true of a painting, the artist has far greater leeway. Each time the sculptor makes his statue more emphatic, more detailed, more literal, he does so at the expense of losing the suggested shapes he also felt inherent in the stone. The artist can manipulate form in a freer fashion, emphasizing one object and highlighting it while still preserving the other suggested shapes that he feels also lie latent within the same form. To him, cubes, circles, angles must not be pure geometrical forms, but a vital source material, more alive to him than the sculpture's stone. The artist, using this analogy, can suggest more than one object arising from the same form. One will be more prominent than the others, according to his purposes and the composition, but the artist is able to get the most out of every given form by suggesting its latent possibilities. He must know how to apply emphasis, however, so that he skirts a fine line between the literal and the abstract. He uses a kind of shorthand objectivism, knowing when and how to specify abstract forms so that the eye completes the picture, filling out objects from forms, though these objects, upon close inspection, do not appear in the usual objective way. This requires the most expert knowledge of structure and a give and take between the forms and the objects from which they come. When properly executed, though, one form can be seen to rise to more than one object and in different perspectives, while not falling off into formlessness. I'm going to read that last sentence again because I think it's important. When properly executed, though, one form then can seem to give rise to more than one object and in different perspectives, while not falling off into formlessness. The aspects of the cube have been treated more fairly in this respect than, for example, the circle. When not being treated decoratively, decoratively. It should be remembered that no circle is flat. Variations in curves and bottles can be used to suggest inner dimensions, otherwise most difficult to represent visually. Through knowing when to apply specific literal strokes, reflections hitting and bouncing off the glass, suggestive, almost inverted perspectives can be built up. These can be effectively reflected in quotes. These can be effectively reflected in other parts of the composition where they can appear differently, and in such a way that the flat surface can contain more levels of depth than would occur in the same space outside of the painting. This technique also results in shifting horizontal levels that are not disruptive, however, but seem to move with their own rhythm, and the objects placed vertically then will not be confined to themselves, though they may be clearly suggested. The eye is positive that they are in a certain place, but when the viewer looks closely, he sees again that the object is not continuous in the usual fashion. This discontinuity actually gives the object more room for motion, and in this way, particularly with landscapes, natural objects appear more alive, though they are less objectively rendered. I am not speaking of a hit-and-miss application of emphasis in the general area of an object to suggest it, but instead of the most precise kind of masterful strokes, suggesting the object itself, in which each stroke must be more precise, because it must bear the brunt of other imaginary strokes deduced by the artist, who completes the object in his mind, though not on canvas, if the artist has not first learned the art of the quick, intuitive brushstroke. If, in other words, he does not know when to strike, then he will be unable to follow this technique with success. The artist can be so clever that different groups of suggested objects can emerge, so that following one horizontal plane with its verticals will condition the eye for the next level. The artist can be so clever that different groups of suggested objects can emerge, so that following one horizontal plane will condition the eye for the next level, where certain objects will seem to appear. Yet such a painting can also be read in quotes, in another manner, so that the horizontals seem to climb the verticals, transforming the objects between into others. In such cases, very difficult to handle, the brush strokes are like different kinds of alphabets, though this is not the best analogy, arranged so that they can be read, however, by one overall translation. You have visual cues that add up to visual statement that does not actually appear in fact. According to the viewer's focus, the statement itself has variations. That is, a house rising out of the form of a cube changes into a rock as the eye shifts, and the other corresponding suggested objects also change. The viewer thinks, now, is that a house or isn't it? For he is sure that he saw a house. Yet he shifts his focus, and lo, the house reappears, and with it the other suggested objects with which it is surrounded at that level, built up through the precise but discontinuous strokes. When he shifts again to see the rock, his eyes follow alternate, discontinuous strokes that construct the rock's appearance with all the suggested objects surrounding it. Let me read that sentence again. When he shifts again to see the rock, his eyes follow alternate, discontinuous strokes that construct the rock's appearance with all the suggested objects surrounding it. These suggested objects must not conflict with each other or oppose each other, of course, and each must lead to the other group smoothly, so that one visual cue will automatically lead to one visual series, while another focus leads to another series. It's up to the artist to compose his painting so that such focuses or main visual cues are arranged in such a way that the viewer is led into a composition at those points already predetermined. The artist is not to be a producer of visual puzzles, however. This technique, in a way, suggests the ambiguity of objects that exist in nature, the give and take between the object and its form, and the way in which we utilize visual cues, using imagination, for instance, to fill in objects not completely seen as we look into the distance. The artist cannot escape his emotions, so no matter how mental the challenges he battles in his paintings, no matter what his technical aspirations, his visual statements will rise from deep emotional realities that he cannot afford to ignore. For the artist, however dedicated, lusts and hates like other men. He yearns for the company of his fellows while avoiding it at the same time. His passions drive him, and passions demand immediate, direct release. An artist's way of using color speaks clearly of his emotional life. Some artists will use raw colors, almost indiscriminately, allowing their passions the most direct route to expression, so that their paintings seem to explode, and the viewer almost leaps back. Some, afraid of their passions at the same time, will use brilliant color, not worrying about values, but will then carefully outline or define these with dark colors as if to allow their emotions release, but hold them back at the same time. To me, at least, such artists are not acquainted with the subtlety of their own feelings, or even hates and loves have merging qualities. The motion of such an exploding painting is over when the viewer sees it. The motion of such an exploding painting is over when the viewer sees it. An explosion has occurred. Instead, I am interested in the propelling forces behind such explosions, the held breath before the shout, the taut stillness before the motion, the merging of the artist's emotional states with his painting through the use of color that is changing as the states themselves. Nature is not really centered, nor are the emotions. They are too alive. So an artist must use his emotions not to dictate his color, but as the energy that drives the brush. My own paintings are filled with danger points or crisis areas in which it seems even the balance of the composition threatens to fall apart, or where perspectives shift in a way particularly dangerous to the painting. These are uneasy areas, and sometimes I let one color ride too closely to another, it would seem, for comfort, or purposefully Let them come into gentle conflict. If the conflict is obvious, the uneasiness explodes. But by using colors and values in such areas that suggest opposition, then emotional imbalances are also aroused and conquered. Because in other areas, the technical challenges are carried off and the imbalances are justified. And this will happen whenever such a painting is viewed. In a way, the artist must recognize his emotions and then organize them so that their effects are distributed throughout his painting in accordance with his wishes, each brushstroke carrying the artist's emotions where he wants them. Otherwise, they will control the painting and run away with the artist entirely. He might as well throw a barrel of paint at a barn for all the control he will have. The intensity of a color, rather than the color itself, suggests emotion. The overall effect of such intensities, used with controlled caution, can set up emotional patterns of motion that flow through a painting, building an emotional statement, step by step, but without letting it get out of control, so that it is, on the one hand, expressed, and on the other, never allowed to explode, but always seemingly about to do so. Violent subjects should be treated with subdued color, otherwise it's too easy to overstate. Here the violence should be delineated through the agitated brushstrokes and through the subdued color. That is, the paint, in such cases, should not be evenly applied. On the other hand, passion can be expressed with great impact on objects or scenes that are not in themselves violent. And painting still lifes, endowing objects with strange instability and motion of their own, can be used very effectively here. The painting of even a lone tree in this manner can be most expressive. In any case, the values cannot be trotted out like well-trained horses, prancing in a predictable way. They must be played one against the other, yet mingled. They must be used with attention to the planes in which they will appear, for their symbolic and emotional content will vary. An intense color being, for example, more emphatic in the vertical and less so in the horizontal, and an upright intensity must have a reflection of lesser nature elsewhere, but not in a predictable fashion. The artist is really in the process of teaching his passions new tricks until finally they leap to his artistic command, seeking artistic expression for themselves as much as he does, and automatically flowing into the painting so that they identify their own expression with artistic expression. Then they will find their own colors, and then, and only then, will the wise artist allow them freedom, knowing that their ends and his own are the same. Much of a painting's perspective, mobility, and vitality is dependent upon what I call graded violences, small, precisely graded assaults made upon so-called purity of line or color, and do not follow an object's form particularly, but operate trans objects. That is, these graded violences, I don't know if I'm saying this clearly, graded violences seem to change their relationship to each other and act as counterpoints to the object's defined stance. When color is used in this way, then not only is an object's color kept in mind, but the color of the surrounding objects, so that when colors are mixed for one portion of a painting, the subordinate or lesser trace dabs must also appear, though not in the same proportions. Color and brushstrokes and planes must work together to the artist's purposes. The various colors with their values represent different degrees of warmth and coolness, obviously, with their indications of distance, and the artist will put these elements together with planes according to his intent. The horizontal planes are sensitive to intense colors, particularly in the foreground, for while they serve as platforms and are supportive, they must still be open enough in values so that they do not crimp the viewer's focus or limit it to one plane, for example, as too intense color can do. Color charts are handy to the beginner or Sunday painter. Outside of that, the artist must constantly observe opaque and transparent light, that is, light or color that seems to belong to an object, and light or color that seems to bathe an object. In the most important ways, no color or light is opaque. Even the dullest object, which seems opaque, as if the color belonged to it, will carry highlights and reflections, nuances of other colors that do not seem to belong to it. These highlights and reflections will also show angles and curves of light and shadow that do not seem to belong to the object itself either. Outdoor painting in the fields or forests will teach the artist more about color than anything else, for it is obvious that no natural object is the same color for any amount of time, but forever changing in color and value and in rhythm with all the surrounding territory. Multitudinous casts of light alter each blade of grass and mountain range, small and large objects alike, bringing them all together in a different synthesis of color or colorscape, that is, itself at any given moment, and also in the process of changing into another. This is not nearly as obvious indoors, but the knowledge gained outside can be utilized in the studio. These changes form patterns of tinted light that include groups of objects in which the objects seem to be contained, while natural objects, trees and fields, retain their position. These patterns of light, of course, do not, so that during the day their relationship to the objects changes, sometimes containing certain objects and sometimes not. Overall, though, these casts of light are dependable in their orderly changes. They form their own objects of color, often as pyramids or cubes, and they cast influences, all of the natural objects they enfold at any given time. I'm going to read that last sentence again. Overall, though, these casts of light are dependable in their orderly changes. They form their own object of color, often as pyramids or cubes, and cast influences. And their cast influences all of the natural objects that they enfold at any given time. It is easy enough to assign this effect to simple reflection, yet the artist who does not simply accept definitions but looks with a wondering eye will see connections between the natural objects and these ever-changing shapes of light. He can use these intersections so that suggested images appear but do not collide with real ones, and so that the light source in a painting is not only the apparent one, but also rises from these casts that further influence color. It is not just that certain casts of light sweep over landscapes with resulting shadows, but that careful attention shows light with shape, or with a shape quality of its own in certain geometrical patterns, whose peculiar cast of light is then added to the basic color of objects. This cast has an iridescent quality and is transparent, in that the natural object is seen just beneath, as the bottom of the ocean is seen shimmering through the shallow water. Capturing such effects requires the cleverness of color glazes applied with many very thin coats that include all of the given objects within a given cast, subtly presented, however, to suggest unity, but not in an obvious way. Color, form, content, perspective, design, brushstrokes, and relationships, all of these are obviously connected one to another, so that the artist holds each element in mind. Even when he is dealing with another, they all exist in relation to the intent he has in any given painting. And often the artist himself cannot grasp his entire intent, only a part of it, while the rest works itself out through the painting itself and through the challenges he has set for himself in the painting's intentions as he understands them. The painting will have its own life also, in that the brushstrokes, colors, line, and forms will always behave somewhat differently as he transposes them from his mind onto the canvas or board. In their own way, they will seek for their own syntheses, and of course, the artist must be sensitive to the difference between his mental pictures and plans and the transformation of these into the painting. Sometimes the painter's execution will go against his wishes to its own advantage. The artist must then decide whether or not to give the painting its way. When this happens, then the painting's elements, the color, form, content, perspective, design, and the relationships between them, seem to organize themselves into patterns he had not counted upon, as if they seized upon the passion of creativity and stole the brush from the artist's hand. If the artist goes along, he will often find afterwards that the process executed plans that before had waited in the wings, that he had not dared to try, or plans that he did not complete, or plans that did not complete themselves until their sudden emergence in the painting. None of the elements of painting can be studied alone to any advantage, however, for they all combine, and creativity is a force of nature in which the artist must always be immersed, whether he is in the act of painting or not. There is a give and take between his own idea of what a painting is to be and the painting's own life, which seems to exist composed of its elements and yet apart from them. When an artist has a deep knowledge of the elements of painting, then, in a way difficult to describe, he sees them as parts of a greater artistic unity, rather than as the separate elements he thought them to be before. A new dimension comes into his work, for the elements combine and seem to multiply in their possibilities, while seeming to become much more simple at the same time. There is a new relationship between the idea of the painting that the artist has in mind and its transformation as it is transferred to the canvas. Seeing his own mental images and organizations, the artist also senses the painting's own intent, or the way that its elements want to combine in response to those images. When he reaches this step, the artist begins to understand what painting really is, and he embarks upon his own peculiar and particular life's work, which will take him into discoveries and achievements, however grand or small, that are his and no one else's. In other words, then, and only then, is the artist really ready to be called an artist in the true meaning of the word. A man must fall into that odd and yet right relationship between his mental picture of a painting and the painting's own natural formations in order to seize upon the necessary tension that allows the painting's elements to combine, following the contours of his and the painting's intents. He and his painting then join forces and are merged into a synthesis of creativity, otherwise not possible. The board or canvas, once it has only one brush stroke upon it, is not just a surface, passive and inert, to be covered with the designs of the artist's mind, but it also becomes endowed with its own artistic life, to which the artist must be true. It is impossible to say what causes this seemingly separate life, which must to some extent deviate from the artist's own intents. Sometimes merely the dimensions of the canvas or the board will alter the artist's conception from the one he had in mind, so that the same design appears in one way mentally and in a different way on the board of the same dimensions as the mental one. Sometimes the nature of the line or cotton is involved. Peculiarities in the absorbing qualities. The paints themselves will behave differently according to the weather or other conditions. All these represent very simple, well-known circumstances. Beyond this, however, it may be that creativity is too volatile, too expressive. And even as the artist holds a mental image of the painting, that image itself is constantly improving itself or trying itself out in other versions. Only one, of course, will result in the given painting. The first brushstrokes may attract others that the artist did not intend. And if the artist feels confused, it is because he is unable to make use of the tension or to flow with it. The completed painting must be a combination of his life and the painting's life. A stroke on canvas yearns to complete itself in its own fashion, yet the artist cannot forsake his own intentions either. Between the two, a creative tension results, and the artist must learn to sense it and ride with it, knowing when to let the elements of the painting follow his own intentions and when to let them follow the painting's own as they develop. The artist then must both lead and follow. This leading and following is paramount.